Will McHugh here, and this is Weird YouTube.
Longlegs isn't disturbing because of what it shows. It's disturbing because of what it's built on. Today, we're going to break down the film from a completely different angle, not as a review, but as an investigation into the real occult structures, demonological traditions, and ritual frameworks that the movie is quietly using beneath the surface. Because when you actually analyze it properly, you start to notice something uncomfortable. The horror doesn't come from jump scares or monsters. It comes from a system, a pattern, something deliberate, structured, and rooted in ideas that didn't originate in the film itself. As always, this is based on esoteric traditions and historical occult texts. We're laying out the connections so you can decide what to do with them. And once you see how this system works, the entire film changes. So let's get into it. For those who haven't seen the film, here is what you need to know before we get into the esoteric analysis. And if you have seen it, stay with me, because the context matters for what comes next. Set in the 1990s in rural Oregon, the story follows FBI agent Lee Harker, a gifted young recruit with what appears to be genuine psychic abilities, as she investigates a series of seemingly unconnected murder-suicides that have been baffling the Bureau for decades. In each case, a father murders his entire family and then takes his own life. There is no apparent motive. There is no history of domestic violence or mental illness in any of the families. There is no financial motive. There is no connection between the families whatsoever. They lived in different towns, had different backgrounds, different income levels, different religions, different lives. The only thread, the only single element linking these cases across years and geography is a cryptic letter found at every scene, signed with the name Longlegs, and filled with coded satanic symbols that no one at the FBI has been able to fully decipher despite years of effort. As the investigation deepens, Harker discovers a pattern that transforms the entire case into something far more sinister and far more structured than a series of tragic domestic murders. Every family had a 9-year-old daughter born on the 14th of the month. Every single one. And the murders occurred within 6 days of that daughter's birthday. More disturbing still, the dates and locations of the murders, when plotted on a map and cross-referenced with a calendar, form an occult triangle, a geometric pattern with clear ritual significance and one final date missing. One final point of the triangle that has not yet been completed. One final family that has not yet been destroyed. The killer, played by Nicolas in what might be the most genuinely unnerving performance of his entire career, is eventually captured. He is a pale, erratic, deeply unsettling figure who speaks in fragments and riddles and who claims to serve an entity he calls the man downstairs. But here is the key revelation, the one that changes absolutely everything about how we should understand this film and everything it is trying to tell us. Longlegs himself never physically killed anyone. Not a single person, not once. He never entered a victim's home with a weapon. He never confronted anyone. He never laid a hand on any member of any family. Instead, he created handcrafted dolls, each one unique, each one made with painstaking attention to detail, each containing a metal orb of immense concentrated energy, and these dolls were delivered to the targeted families by an accomplice. That accomplice turns out to be Lee Harker's own mother, Ruth, a deeply religious woman who had made a deal with Longlegs years earlier to spare her daughter's life in exchange for her cooperation in delivering the dolls to the other families. Once a doll entered a household, once it crossed the threshold of the home and took its place inside the domestic space, the father of that family would gradually become possessed by the entity's influence and would ultimately destroy his own family from within, with his own hands, in his own home, without ever understanding what had happened to him or why. So the mechanism of the murders was never brute force. It was never a masked intruder breaking through a window at night. It was ritual. It was process. It was structure. It was a meticulously designed system of carefully crafted objects, willing and unwilling human agents, binding pacts sealed under duress, and accumulated ritual intention operating across decades toward the completion of a geometric pattern. And that, my friends, is precisely where the real occultism begins. Let us start with the ritual system itself, because this is where the film first reveals its hand to anyone who knows what they are looking at. What happens in this film is not random horror invention. It is not the product of a screenwriter who thought dark symbols and creepy dolls would look atmospheric on camera and threw them in for aesthetic effect. It follows a very specific operational structure that anyone familiar with ceremonial magic or classical demonology will recognize immediately, and that structure is one of the oldest and most rigorously codified frameworks in the entire Western esoteric tradition. In the film, Longlegs does not interact with the victims directly. He does not enter their homes. He does not confront them on the street or in a parking lot. He does not stalk them through the night or leave threatening messages on their doors or lurk outside their windows. There is no physical confrontation at any point, no chase scene, no violence from his hands. He never even sees the people he destroys. Instead, he follows a precise operational sequence, a chain of steps that mirrors the procedural logic of ceremonial magic down to its fundamental components. First, there is preparation, the creation of the dolls, which requires time, craftsmanship, specific materials, and sustained ritual intention focused on a specific target. Each doll is unique. Each is made for one particular child. Each is infused with a specific charge through the metal orb placed inside it. Then there is the intermediary object, the doll itself, which serves as the carrier, the vessel that transports the influence from the operator to the target without the operator ever needing to be physically present or even geographically close. Then there is the intermediary agent, Ruth, who physically delivers the object into the household, bridging the gap between the operator's isolated world and the victim's domestic world with a human face that the families will trust and welcome. Then there is indirect execution. The father is influenced through the object to commit the act of destruction, never knowing he is under any external influence at all, believing with absolute certainty that his thoughts, his feelings, his murderous impulses are entirely his own. And finally, there is an accumulative result. Each murder completes one point of a larger geometric ritual pattern that spans years and decades, building toward an ultimate objective that the individual participants in the system never see, never comprehend, and never even suspect. Now I want to emphasize something here because it is important. This is not something a screenwriter dreamed up from scratch. This operational structure corresponds directly to the logic found in the foundational texts of Western ceremonial magic, and most specifically in the Ars Goetia, the first section of the 17th century grimoire known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, or Lemageten. For those of you who are not familiar with this text, the Ars Goetia is arguably the single most influential document in the Western demonological tradition. It catalogues 72 demonic entities, each with a specific rank in the infernal hierarchy, a specific set of powers and areas of influence, a specific sigil or geometric symbol that must be drawn with precision to establish contact with that particular entity, and a specific set of ritual protocols that the magician must follow in exact order to maintain authority over the interaction and prevent the entity from turning against him. And the core principle of this entire system, the principle upon which absolutely everything else depends, is that the practitioner never interacts with the entity directly in an uncontrolled way. There must always be a protective circle drawn on the ground, which represents the absolute boundary of the magician's safety and authority, and which the entity cannot cross. There must be specific sigils inscribed on parchment or metal to identify and constrain the entity being summoned. There must be prescribed invocations drawing on divine names, angelic authorities, and sacred words to establish the magician's right to command the spirit. There must be specific tools, specific incense, specific timing according to planetary hours and astrological conditions, and there must be a chain of intermediary steps between the operator and the force being invoked, a series of buffers and controls that keep the magician at a safe distance from the raw power he is attempting to direct. The magician does not simply light a candle and call a demon's name and hope for the best. That, according to every single text in this tradition without exception, would be the equivalent of grabbing a live power line with wet hands. Every interaction must be mediated. Every contact must be channeled through layers of ritual structure. Every step must be controlled, measured, and protected. If the protocol breaks, if a word is mispronounced, if a sigil is drawn incorrectly, if a step is skipped, if the magician's concentration wavers at the wrong moment, the consequences described in these texts are absolute and catastrophic. The entity breaks free of its constraints, the protective barriers fail, and the magician pays the price, which according to the texts ranges from madness to physical destruction to consequences that extend beyond the operator to his family, his household, and everyone connected to him. The warnings in these grimoires are consistent, detailed, and utterly unambiguous. The ritual structure is not aesthetic decoration. It is not tradition for tradition's sake. It is the only thing standing between the practitioner and forces that will destroy him if given the slightest opportunity. This principle of mediated, structured, indirect operation is not exclusive to the Ars Goetia. You will find it throughout the entire corpus of Western ceremonial magic. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa emphasized it in his 3 books of occult philosophy in the early 16th century. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn built their entire system of magical practice around it in the late 19th century. Eliphas Levi wrote about it extensively. The principle is universal. Raw spiritual or demonic power must be channeled through a system of ritual conductors and insulators, or it will annihilate the person who attempts to wield it. Now look at Longlegs again through this lens and tell me the parallels are coincidental. He is the operator of a ritual. He does not kill with his hands. He executes a process. The dolls are the intermediary objects, the vessels that carry the charge from the source to the target. The coded letters found at each scene are the sigils, encrypted symbolic markers that serve functions within the ritual structure, even if the FBI cannot decode them. Ruth is the intermediary agent, the human conduit who physically bridges the gap between the operator and the targets with a face that disarms suspicion. The families of the targets, selected according to precise and unvarying criteria that mirror the specificity demanded by grimoire operations. The entity Longlegs calls the man downstairs is the force being channeled, the power source that animates the entire operation but never directly manifests. And the triangle formed by the dates and locations of the murders is the macro-ritual, the overarching ceremonial structure being completed one point at a time over the course of decades, each individual murder functioning as a single operation within a grander design, like one invocation within a ceremony that spans not hours but an entire human lifetime. This is not a slasher film. This is not a serial killer thriller with a supernatural coat of paint. This is ceremonial magic depicted on screen with a structural fidelity that is genuinely remarkable. and the fact that most audiences walk out of the theater without recognizing it as such does not diminish the accuracy. If anything, it reinforces one of the film's most disturbing themes, which is that the most effective rituals are the ones that nobody recognizes as rituals. The most effective systems of control are the ones that the people inside them cannot see. Now let us talk about the dolls themselves, because they are far more than a creepy visual designed to make audiences squirm in their seats. They represent one of the oldest, most widespread, and most consistently documented principles in the entire history of human magical practice, a principle that has been found on every continent, in virtually every civilization that has ever existed, spanning thousands of years of recorded history and stretching back into prehistory beyond the reach of written records. That principle is called sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is based on an idea so simple that it almost sounds naive until you realize how deeply and how universally it permeates every magical tradition the human race has ever produced. The idea is this: an object that represents a person can be used to affect that person across any distance. What happens to the object happens to the individual. Create a figure in someone's likeness, bind it to them through personal items or through concentrated ritual intention. And you have created a bridge, a link, a channel through which influence can be directed at the target without the operator ever needing to be in the same room, the same city, or even the same country. Sir James George Frazer laid out the theoretical framework for understanding this in his monumental anthropological work, The Golden Bough, first published in 1890. Frazer identified two laws governing sympathetic magic. The first is the law of similarity, which states that that an image of a thing partakes of the essence and nature of that thing, that there is an invisible but real connection between a representation and what it represents. The second is the law of contagion, which states that things which have once been in physical contact continue to influence each other even after the contact has been severed, which is why personal items like hair, nail clippings, blood, or worn clothing are used to strengthen the link between an effigy and its target. These two laws together form the theoretical foundation of all effigy-based magic across all cultures and all periods of history. And the historical record for this practice is staggering in its breadth and its depth. In ancient Egypt, wax figurines were used in state-level magical operations as early as the second millennium before our era. During the reign of Ramesses III, around 1150 before our era, a conspiracy was uncovered in which court officials had created wax images of the pharaoh and performed destructive rituals over them with the intention of killing him. This was not a rumor or a folk tale. It was documented in the judicial papyrus of Turin, one of the oldest surviving legal records in human history, and the conspirators were tried and executed. Effigy magic was taken seriously at the very highest levels of one of the most powerful empires the ancient world ever produced. In ancient Greece, similar figurines were called kolossoi, and they were used for an impressive range of magical purposes, including curses, love spells, spirit binding, the constraint of ghosts and the dead, and even the manipulation of gods. Archaeologists have recovered numerous examples of these figures from grave sites and crossroads across the Greek world, often pierced with bronze nails, bound with lead strips inscribed with curses, sometimes with their hands tied behind their backs or their mouths sealed. The Greek magical papyri, that extraordinary collection of spells and ritual instructions from Greco-Roman Egypt spanning from the 2nd century before our era to the 5th century of our era, contain detailed and specific instructions for creating these figures, including what materials to use, what divine names to speak during construction, what planetary hours to observe, and where to place the completed figure for maximum effect. In medieval and early modern Europe, these figures were called poppets, and they occupied a central place in both actual folk magic practice and in the witchcraft accusations that sent tens of thousands of people to their deaths over the course of several centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum, written by the Dominican Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer in 1487, and arguably the most destructive book ever written on the subject of witchcraft, specifically and repeatedly described how witches used wax or clay effigies to inflict pain, illness, madness, and death on their victims from a distance. During the great witch trials that swept across Europe from the 15th through the 18th centuries, the possession of any figure that could be interpreted as a poppet was frequently cited as damning evidence of maleficium, the practice of harmful magic, and was often sufficient to secure a conviction and a death sentence. And of course, most people today, when they think of effigy magic, think of voodoo dolls. But the reality is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than the popular image suggests. The pin-stuck voodoo doll that everyone knows from movies and television is actually far more a product of European folk magic tradition than of authentic Haitian voodoo. The image was projected onto African-derived spiritual traditions during the colonial era, primarily as a tool of cultural demonization and racial propaganda designed to make enslaved people's spiritual practices appear primitive, savage, and threatening to white Christian society. In actual voodoo practice, dolls and figurines serve primarily as focal points for healing, spiritual communication, and connection with the Elulue, the spirits of the Vodou religion. They are tools of devotion, not weapons of destruction. The malevolent voodoo doll is largely a Western European invention attributed to an African tradition that had very little to do with it. But across all of these traditions, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, from Egyptian court sorcery to Greek depictions to medieval European puppets to folk practices on every continent, the underlying principle is identical. An effigy is created to represent a specific individual. It is bound to the target through personal items, bodily materials, or concentrated ritual intention. And from that moment on, the effigy functions as a conduit, a bridge, a channel through which influence, whether beneficial or destructive, can be directed at the person it represents across any distance. The object and the person are linked by an invisible connection that transcends physical space, and that link remains active as long as the object exists and the binding intention is maintained. Now look at the dolls in Longlegs with all of this in mind. They are not decoration, they are not props, they are not trophies collected by a disturbed mind. They are functional ritual objects operating according to the exact logic of sympathetic magic as it has been documented across every era and every culture for thousands of years. Each doll is handcrafted by Longlegs for a specific child, not mass-produced, not generic, specific, individual, made with intention directed at one particular target. Each doll contains a metal orb of concentrated energy that serves as the active charge, the power source that animates the sympathetic link and connects the figure to the entity's influence. And once the doll crosses the threshold of the home and takes its place inside the domestic space, it functions as a bridge, channeling the entity's influence into the household, specifically targeting the father, gradually overwhelming his will, his identity, his capacity for resistance, and driving him to destroy his own family while believing he is acting of his own volition. The doll is the sympathetic bond. It is the link. It is the bridge between the invisible world of the entity and the physical world of the family. Without it, the ritual cannot function. The entity has no way to reach the target. The operator has no mechanism to direct the influence. The entire system collapses. Everything depends on this object, this effigy, this piece of ancient magical technology that humanity has used, feared, and documented since long before the pyramids were built. There is a principle that recurs across nearly every tradition of Western esotericism and demonology, a principle so consistent, so universal, so deeply embedded across systems that otherwise disagree on almost everything else, that it functions less like a theological opinion and more like a natural law within the esoteric worldview. It is absolutely central to understanding this film, and it is the principle that elevates Longlegs from a well-crafted horror movie to something that is genuinely, authentically unsettling for anyone who knows these traditions. The principle is this: the forces of darkness cannot enter without permission. Evil requires consent. This idea shows up everywhere you look in the esoteric record, and it shows up with a consistency that is frankly remarkable given how much these traditions disagree on virtually everything else. In Christian demonology, demonic possession is traditionally understood to require some form of opening on the part of the victim, whether through deliberate ritual invocation, moral transgression, engagement with forbidden spiritual practices, or some form of voluntary participation that creates a point of spiritual vulnerability. The Catholic rite of exorcism, codified in the Ritual Romanum, is built entirely on the assumption that the demon entered through a specific opening, and the exorcist must identify that opening and close it, because if it remains open, the entity will return no matter how many times it is expelled. In the grimoire traditions, the principle is even more explicit. Every summoning requires the deliberate, focused, and intentional will of the practitioner. No entity manifests by accident. No demon wanders into a magic circle uninvited. The operator must draw the sigils, speak the invocations, burn the correct incense, observe the correct planetary timing, and actively, consciously open the channel. The entire elaborate apparatus of ceremonial magic, all those circles and triangles and divine names and angelic seals, exists precisely because the contact must be initiated and controlled from the human side. The entities may be ancient and powerful beyond human comprehension, but they are bound by rules. They cannot simply appear wherever they want and do whatever they please. They need a door, and that door must be opened by a human hand. You will find this same principle embedded in the folklore of the vampire, which across virtually every European tradition insists that the creature cannot cross the threshold of a home unless it is invited inside by someone who lives there. This detail, which most people today know only from Bram Stoker's Dracula and its countless adaptations, actually has deep and ancient roots in folk belief and magical tradition, stretching back centuries before Stoker was born. The threshold of the home is a sacred boundary, a liminal space charged with protective power, and its violation without permission is a transgression that even supernatural entities of enormous power cannot commit. You will find it in the tradition of the Faustian Pact, where the devil does not arrive by force or by accident. He appears when summoned, or he appears when the human has placed himself in a position of spiritual vulnerability through despair, ambition, pride, or reckless curiosity. And even then, he does not simply take what he wants. He offers. He presents terms. He negotiates. He shows you what you desire and asks if you would like to have it. And you must say yes. The deal requires 2 signatures. Without the human's consent, freely given, even if given under enormous pressure, the contract has no binding force and the transaction cannot proceed. This is a universal principle in the esoteric understanding of reality. The dark does not kick down doors. It does not smash through walls. It does not arrive with overwhelming force and impose its will by brute power. It knocks, it whispers, it offers, it seduces, it presents itself as a gift, a solution, an opportunity, a friend. It shows you exactly what you want and asks you very politely if you would like to accept it. But it cannot, under the rules that govern its existence and its interaction with the human world, cross the threshold without an opening. And that opening must be provided by a human being, whether that human being knows what they are doing or not. Now in the film, this principle operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and each level demonstrates a different facet of how consent functions in the esoteric worldview. At the most visible level, the families accept the dolls into their homes. They do not know what the objects are. They do not understand their function. They have no idea that they are bringing a charged ritual weapon across the sacred boundary of their domestic threshold. But the act of acceptance, of taking the object from Ruth's hands, of bringing it inside, of placing it in the child's room, of welcoming it into the most intimate and protected space available to a human family, constitutes the opening. The threshold has been breached, not by force, by invitation. The families themselves, in their innocence, in their trust, in their completely understandable assumption that a gift from a nun must be something blessed and good, provide the consent that the ritual requires. They open the door with their own hands. They carry the instrument of their own destruction across their own threshold. And they do it with a smile. At a deeper level, Lee Harker's mother Ruth accepts the terms of the pact with full awareness that she is dealing with something dark and something dangerous. She is presented with a choice that is really no choice at all, at least not from the perspective of a mother who loves her child, her daughter's life, or her cooperation. And she chooses. She says yes. That moment of consent, that single decision made in a moment of terror and desperation, activates the entire system. Without Ruth's acceptance, the mechanism has no intermediary. Longlegs himself cannot deliver the dolls. He is the operator, but the ritual requires a human agent who has freely chosen to participate, someone whose consent provides the moral and metaphysical fuel that the system needs to function. The entity needs a human channel. The ritual needs human hands. And Ruth provides both. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb anyone who thinks carefully about it. The consent does not need to be fully informed. Ruth did not understand the full scope of what she was agreeing to. She understood the immediate terms, but not the ultimate cost. The families did not know what the dolls were. The fathers had no awareness whatsoever that they were under any external influence. But at every single level of the system, from the top to the bottom, there was a moment of acceptance, a moment where a human being said yes to something, and that was all the system needed, not informed consent, not enthusiastic consent, not consent given with full understanding of all the implications and consequences, just consent, just a yes, just a door opened even a crack, just a threshold crossed even by an inch. That tiny, unremarkable, seemingly insignificant moment of acceptance is the only thing the darkness needed to enter, and it got it, every single time. This is not a narrative convenience. This is not a plot device designed to make the story work. This is how the esoteric tradition, across centuries of documentation and analysis and debate, says it actually works. And the film follows this logic with a precision that goes beyond coincidence and into the territory of deliberate, studied, and deeply informed construction. The deal between Ruth and Longlegs follows a structure that has been documented in demonological literature for centuries, and following it as closely as the film does would have required either extensive research into these texts or an intuitive understanding of these principles that borders on the uncanny. It is the classic demonic pact, one of the most enduring and most consistently structured motifs in the entire history of Western occultism. In European grimoire traditions and in the vast body of folklore that surrounds them, the pact with a demonic entity follows a remarkably consistent template that barely changes across centuries, countries, languages, or cultural contexts. The human offers something: a service, obedience, a soul, a sacrifice, a commitment to perform specific actions over a specific period of time. In return, the human receives something they desperately want: protection, power, knowledge, wealth, love, the ability to save someone they care about. But the payment is never what it appears to be. There is always a hidden dimension to the cost, always an indirect consequence that the human did not anticipate, always a clause buried in the structure of the deal that reveals itself only after the commitment has been made and it is too late to walk away. The deal is honored to the letter. Every promise is kept, every term is fulfilled. But the spirit of the agreement, the human's understanding of what they were actually agreeing to, is violated completely. And the human discovers, always too late, always after the damage has been done, that the price was far greater, far wider, and far more destructive than anything they imagined when they said yes. The Faustian bargain is the most famous literary expression of this template, immortalized by Marlowe in the 16th century and by Goethe in the 19th. But the concept of the demonic pact predates the Faust legend by hundreds of years. Medieval European folklore is saturated with stories of deals made with the devil or with demonic entities, appearing in sermons, hagiographies, morality tales, and even in legal records where people were actually tried and convicted for allegedly entering into pacts with infernal powers. The theologian Caesarius of Heisterbach collected dozens of such accounts in his Dialogus Miraculorum in the early 13th century. The Grand Grimoire, a French text dating to approximately the 18th century, contains detailed practical instructions for summoning Lucifuge Rofocal, described as the Prime Minister of Hell, and negotiating a binding pact with him. The text specifies what the operator must offer, what he may ask for in return, what protections he must have in place, and what will happen if the negotiation fails or if the terms are violated by either party. The entire interaction is framed not as a supernatural event, but as a contractual negotiation, a business transaction between two parties with competing interests, governed by rules that both parties are obligated to follow. This is important because it tells us something fundamental about the esoteric conception of demonic forces. They do not simply take, they deal, they negotiate, they follow rules. Terrible, horrifying, monstrous rules, but rules nonetheless. There is a structure, there is a protocol, and both parties, the human and the entity, are bound by the terms once the agreement is made. The entity cannot take more than was agreed, but it will take everything that was agreed and it will interpret the terms in whatever way serves its interests most completely. Ruth's situation in the film maps onto this tradition so precisely that it could serve as a case study in a textbook on demonological pact structures. She offers her cooperation, her ongoing service as the deliverer of the ritual objects to the targeted families. In return, her daughter Lee is spared from the destruction that claims all the other children. Lee's doll is different from the others. Instead of channeling the entity's destructive influence, it suppresses Lee's memories of her childhood encounter with Longlegs and the entity, effectively placing her under a kind of protective enchantment that keeps her safe but also keeps her ignorant of her own history and her own connection to the horror that has been unfolding around her for her entire life. Ruth's daughter lives. Ruth's daughter is protected. The terms of the deal are honored with scrupulous precision, but the price, the real price, the price that Ruth either did not fully understand or understood, but could not bring herself to refuse. She condemns dozens of other families to total destruction. She becomes the direct and personal instrument of their annihilation. Every doll she delivers, every home she enters dressed in the habit of a nun, carrying what appears to be a gift from the church, is a death sentence for the family that receives it. A father will be driven to murder. Children will die. A family will be erased from existence. And Ruth knows this. She knows it every single time she knocks on a door with a doll in her hands. She knows it, and she does it anyway, again and again, year after year, for decades, because the alternative is losing her own daughter. One child saved, dozens destroyed. That is the mathematics of the deal. That is the exchange rate of the pact. This concept has a specific name in the study of demonological traditions. It is called displaced sacrifice. The beneficiary of the pact is protected, but the cost of that protection is transferred, displaced, onto others who had no part in the negotiation, no knowledge of its existence, and no ability to refuse or resist. The system demands blood. It demands destruction. It demands sacrifice, and it gets all of these things. Just not from the person who made the deal. The debt is paid in full, but it is paid with other people's lives, other people's children, other people's futures. And the entity is satisfied because the terms were met, and the terms are all that matters. And here is what makes the demonic pact so insidious in the esoteric understanding, and what makes Ruth's situation in the film so perfectly aligned with the tradition. The demon does not lie, not technically, not in the narrow, legalistic sense. It tells you what it wants. It tells you what it will give you in return. It lays out the terms, but it tells you in a way that allows you, even encourages you, to deceive yourself about the true scope and nature of the cost. The deception is not in the demon's words. The deception is in your interpretation of those words, in your desperate willingness to believe that the price is acceptable, that the trade is manageable, that you can live with the consequences. Ruth believed she was making a survivable exchange. She was becoming a serial instrument of mass murder. The terms were clear. Her understanding was not. And the entity, the system, the force behind the pact relied on that gap, that space between the letter and the spirit, to get exactly what it wanted from the very beginning. In virtually every esoteric and religious tradition across the world, the home occupies a position of enormous symbolic and spiritual importance. It is not merely a physical structure made of walls and a roof and windows. It is a sacred space. It is a protected zone. It is a microcosm of cosmic order expressed on the human scale, a small island of structure and harmony and safety in the middle of a chaotic and often hostile world. The family that inhabits it represents the fundamental unit of human social harmony, and the threshold of the home, the doorway, the entrance, the boundary between inside and outside, is the most symbolically charged element of all. It is where the ordered world meets the disordered world, where the known meets the unknown, where what is ours meets what is other. This is why every magical and religious tradition on Earth places protective symbols and rituals at the entrances of homes, the mezuzah in Jewish tradition, the offerings to Janus in ancient Rome, the horseshoes and salt lines and rowan branches of European folk magic, the feng shui treatment of the entrance in Chinese tradition. The principle is universal, and the message is unanimous. The home is sacred. Its boundary must be maintained. Its violation by malevolent forces is among the most serious transgressions that the symbolic order recognizes. And because of this, The deliberate corruption of the home and the family carries immense weight in occult thought. When you destroy the sacred, the effect is exponentially greater than destroying the profane. This is the foundational logic of inversionary ritual. The power of inversion comes from the magnitude of the contrast. The more holy the original form, the more potent its corruption. The more sacred the space, the more devastating its profanation. In the film, every murder takes place inside the home. The father becomes the destroyer. The family is annihilated from within by the person entrusted with its protection. And this is not incidental. This is the design. The corruption erupts from the center of the sacred space. The profanation originates from the heart of what was supposed to be holy. And then there is Ruth dressed as a nun. The church, the symbolic institution of divine protection and moral authority, becomes the delivery mechanism for destruction. The families trust her because she represents God. They open their doors because they think heaven has sent them a gift. They carry their own annihilation across their own threshold with gratitude and reverence. The sacred is not merely absent, it is weaponized, turned against the very people it is supposed to protect. And that, in the esoteric understanding, is the signature methodology of the adversary. Not the destruction of the sacred, its inversion, its corruption, its deployment as a tool of the very evil it was meant to prevent. The entity that Longlegs calls the man downstairs never appears directly in the film. We never see it. We never see it walk through a room or confront a character or manifest in physical form. We hear a voice. We feel a presence. We see its effects in every destroyed family and every corrupted life. But the entity itself remains invisible, always behind the curtain, always operating through layers of human intermediaries. This is consistent with a fundamental principle in demonological literature that has been articulated for centuries. Many entities in the classical demonological texts do not act in the physical world directly. They operate through intermediaries. They influence, they corrupt, they whisper, they direct. But the human provides the hands. The entity provides the intention and the power. The human provides the physical capacity to act in the material world. This is simultaneously the entity's limitation and its most devastating strategy. It depends on human cooperation, but that dependency makes it invisible. You cannot fight what you cannot see. You cannot resist what you don't know is there. You cannot escape a system you don't even realize exists. In the film, Longlegs builds the infrastructure. Ruth delivers the instruments. The dolls serve as channels. The fathers execute the destruction. The entity sits at the center of a web where every node is a human being recruited through consent or deception or desperation. This is not a monster, this is a system. And that is precisely what makes it align with real demonological thought. The most terrifying thing in this film has no face, no body, no voice of its own. It has only an architecture, and that architecture is made entirely of human beings. The murders follow a strict pattern maintained over decades. Same family profile, same age of daughter, same birth date marker, same method, same coded letter. The ritual repeats with obsessive precision, each iteration adding one more point to the larger geometric structure. In ceremonial magic, repetition is essential. It is the mechanism through which ritual acquires and compounds power. A single ritual performance produces a limited effect. The same ritual repeated dozens of times over years, following exact parameters, builds cumulative force that is incomparably greater than any single performance. This is documented across every serious magical tradition. The Golden Dawn prescribed daily repetition of rituals over months and years. Kabbalistic practices require specific numbers of repetitions. Tibetan mantras are chanted hundreds of thousands of times. Folk spells are cast in series of 3, 7, or 9. The murders in Longlegs are not isolated crimes. They are iterations. Each feeds the pattern, each compounds the power, each adds one more charged point to the geometric figure being inscribed across decades. When you understand this, the horror transforms completely. These are not acts of random violence. They are components of a decades-long ceremonial operation, each family destroyed as one precise step toward the completion of a macro ritual whose full purpose we can only guess at, but whose structure is unmistakable. The triangle that emerges from the murder pattern carries deep esoteric significance. In these traditions, geometry is never decorative. Every shape encodes meaning. The upward triangle represents divinity, ascent, fire, the masculine principle, the Holy Trinity. Inverted, it represents descent, matter, water, rebellion against divine order. In ceremonial magic, the triangle serves a specific practical function as the triangle of art, the constrained space within which a summoned entity is forced to manifest. In the Ars Goetia, the magician stands inside the circle while the entity appears inside the triangle. The triangle is simultaneously the space of manifestation and the limit of power. In the film, the triangle formed by the murders encodes all of this. Each point is charged by a sacrifice, and the fact that one point remains incomplete mirrors a critical principle in ceremonial magic. An incomplete ritual is an open circuit. It generates instability. It generates demand. It must be closed. The forces involved push toward closure with immense, relentless pressure like water against an unsealed dam. This is why the entire film drives toward the final point. The ritual demands completion. The entity demands completion. The accumulated energy of decades of sacrifice demands completion. Every pact, every doll, every death has been building toward this single geometric closure, and in the esoteric understanding, an unfinished ritual is not merely incomplete. It is dangerous, it is a wound, and it will not rest until it is sealed. Evil as invisible architecture. And so we arrive at the center, the esoteric law that underlies everything we have discussed, the principle that makes this film genuinely unsettling for anyone who knows these traditions, because it is not fiction. It is documented. It is ancient. And it has been warned about for centuries by people who spent their lives studying forces that most of us prefer to pretend do not exist. The principle is this: evil does not need force. It needs structure and participation. Longlegs does not overpower anyone. The entity does not break down doors. Nobody is physically attacked by a supernatural force. Instead, a system is created. A ritual architecture is built piece by piece over decades with infinite patience. Objects are crafted with specific intention. Channels are established through cultivated relationships. Consent is obtained through manipulation, through love, through fear, through desperation, through the exploitation of everything that makes us human. Intermediaries are recruited, each playing their role without ever seeing the whole design. And the participants, every single one, play their part within the structure without ever understanding what they are part of. The mother consents to save her daughter and becomes death's courier. The families accept the dolls because they trust the woman who brings them. The fathers act under an influence they cannot perceive. Even Harker has been inside the system her entire life without knowing it. Her memories erased, her participation guaranteed from the moment her mother said yes to a deal she did not fully understand, decades before Lee existed. This is the esoteric worldview in its purest and most terrifying expression. Evil operates through invisible architecture. through silent rituals performed over lifetimes, through pacts sealed in desperation, through harmless-looking objects that carry terrible weight, through repetition and pattern and the slow, patient, relentless accumulation of corrupted consent, through a web where everyone plays their part and nobody sees the whole picture. And that is exactly what the grimoires describe. That is what the demonological literature warns about. That is what centuries of esoteric tradition have said consistently and urgently across every language and every era. The adversary does not arrive with horns and fire. It does not announce itself. It does not kick down doors. It comes with a structure, a process, and an invitation. It comes dressed as a gift. It comes through the hands of someone you trust. It comes with a warm smile and a blessing on its lips, and it waits with a patience measured not in hours or days, but in decades and generations, for you to say yes. That is the real horror of Longlegs, not the blood on the walls, not Nicolas Cage's performance, extraordinary as it is. The real horror is the realization that the system this film depicts, the architecture of ritual, consent, objects, intermediaries, repetition, and geometric completion, is not invented. It is documented in texts that span centuries. It is consistent across traditions that agree on virtually nothing else. And according to those who have spent their lives immersed in this literature, the people who have studied grimoires and demonological manuals and esoteric treatises, not as curiosities, but as maps of something real, the principles this film depicts are not metaphors. They are not allegories. They are descriptions of how it actually works. So think about that. Think about it the next time someone brings you a gift and you don't know where it came from. Think about it the next time you're presented with a deal that seems too good to be true and the terms seem just a little too simple. And think about it the next time you say yes to something without fully understanding what you are saying yes to. Because according to centuries of esoteric tradition, that moment of acceptance, that simple, unremarkable, forgettable yes, is the only key the darkness has ever needed, and it has been waiting for it patiently at your threshold for longer than you can imagine. Well, my friends, have a good day wherever you are, and look carefully at what's at the end of your forks. If you made it this far, subscribe and leave your opinion, a request, or a greeting in the comments.